Not too long ago, Nintendo revealed the Switch 2's pricing, which shocked people with its $450 price tag. But things got worse as people learned that games are going to be between $70 to $80. A pair of Joy-Cons are going to be $95, and the camera, for example, is going to be $55. People also weren't thrilled about the fact that the physical copies from many games are not going to have the actual game on them. But I'm not terribly surprised by that, considering how digital the industry is nowadays, for better or for worse. But there is one more move Nintendo made that got a lot of people talking again, and it has to do with their end-user license agreement. Apparently, Nintendo explicitly states in their new end-user agreement that they reserve the right to render your system completely unusable in response to any unauthorized usage. Of course, people are outraged, and I'm going to get into that at some point, but the truth is, Nintendo has already been bricking people's systems for years and years now. It just wasn't as deliberate as it is now. I remember during the 3DS days when people were installing custom firmware on their systems, and sometimes a system update would come up and those could potentially brick the 3DS, depending on what Nintendo decided to do with said update. You always had to check out whether people needed to update their firmware before proceeding, and you needed to keep the system up to date anyway in order to get on the eShop. So it mattered. In fact, Nintendo would continue to update the 3DS until the very end of the 3DS eShop. I still remember one update from around that time that required a firmware update, because otherwise, if you had a system with custom firmware, running the update would brick it. Yeah, they managed to brick people's systems that late into the 3DS's lifespan, over a decade in. This was also true for the first Switch. It didn't take long for custom firmware to be released because the system security was terrible, and with every update came the possibility of someone's hacked Switch getting bricked. In fact, you can find plenty of instances of people trying to fix their hacked Switches after an update went wrong. When you use custom firmware, you're taking a risk, and most people that are involved in that community are quick to point that out. And sometimes you don't even need custom firmware to get your system bricked. Nintendo accidentally bricked a bunch of Switches with the 20.0.0 update recently. Now, of course, they rolled out the 20.0.1 update to fix this issue pretty quickly. So Nintendo can also just do this on accident, not just out of spite. So obviously, bricking systems is nothing new for Nintendo. But what is new now that wasn't true, let's say, several years ago? Well, it has to be the anti-consumer warpath that Nintendo has been pursuing for the last couple of years on multiple fronts. But let's start with the anti-emulation crusade they've been on. So they went after Yuzu and got that Switch emulator shut down. Then they started DMCAing the Yuzu forks that came out after that. Yuzu's demise also brought about the closure of the Citra project, which was the only major 3DS emulator out at the time. And then Nintendo made a deal with Ryujinx to get that emulator pulled, but do keep in mind that this was not a DMCA takedown, so the Ryujinx devs got something out of it, I'm sure. So they took out practically all of the Switch emulators out there. Their main argument behind going after the Switch emulators has been Section 1201 of the DMCA. They argue that because you need to decrypt the games in order to run them in an emulator, users of these emulators would be in violation of US copyright law, and same for any emulators that do this decryption as well. However, emulating games using ROM dumps of your own copies through decryption could actually qualify as fair use as a format shift, as Nintendo's arguments have not been established as precedent in a court of law in this case, at least not in the US. And the thing is, they don't actually want a decision from a judge necessarily, because a judge could potentially rule against them and set a precedent that is worse for them than the status quo in this situation. So part of Nintendo's strategy instead is to bully these emulator devs through DMCA takedowns, because it's expensive for these smaller devs to fight a massive corporation like Nintendo in court. Speaking of that, remember when Sony lost their court case against Bleem over emulation over 2 decades ago? Well, Sony got the last laugh in a way because Bleem went under due to the amount of money they lost fighting Sony in court. So that's a safer tactic for these bigger companies to take instead of going in front of a judge. Most of the time, they only take their cases to court when it's a slam dunk. Like for example, the guy who made the MiG Switch flash cart got sued and has decided to go to court against Nintendo without a lawyer, instead of continuing to abide by the original takedown request, which is incredibly stupid. But the thing about this case is not so much the flash card itself, the mod chip, or the other products sold by this individual. The thing is, these carts would often be sold with pirated Nintendo games included. That's an easy case for Nintendo to fight in court. And the defendant should have settled out of court with Nintendo instead of being a moron. If you're crazy enough to continue to pirate Nintendo's games after being warned by them not to do so, you're asking for trouble. But there is one notable case involving Nintendo that has nothing to do with their anti-emulation crusade, and it is their case against Palworld. This is one of the only lawsuits they filed recently that is not a clear slam dunk for the company, but it is an attack on competitors and indirectly an attack on consumers. Instead of going after the developers of Palworld for copyright infringement, they instead went after them for patent infringement in Japan, for 3 patents in particular. What's odd here is that Nintendo filed these patents after Palworld launched, but since they filed in Japan, that might not matter so much, so Nintendo might be able to get away with this under Japanese law. Now, the Palworld developers have removed some things from the game in order to get out of the crosshairs, so to speak, like no longer being able to use the pals for gliding like they did recently in an update, as well as some other things. They're obviously planning for a worst case scenario in court, but it's not clear whether Nintendo will win the case or not. That being said, it is Nintendo being incredibly protective of the Pokemon IP to the point of trying to destroy games that look similar. So why do I bring up all of these heavy-handed moves Nintendo has been making? Because the new end-user license agreement is just another part of the anti-consumer direction they've been pursuing for years now. They want you to own nothing and be happy. And it gets even worse than what I've been talking about. One, there's the fact that Nintendo is pretty much spying on users by default with their new game chat feature. At least you're supposed to be able to disable that tracking, thankfully. There's even another stipulation in the end-user license agreement that tries to stop people from participating in class action lawsuits in the future. That is absolutely insane, and I don't think that would hold up in a court of law in the future. Nintendo has faced some class action lawsuits in the past over the original Switch's Joy-Cons, but nothing has come of them yet, as far as I know, so maybe Nintendo is worried about that kind of situation again. Or maybe they just want to throw their weight around like they always do. Probably some combination of two if I had to take a guess. So if they accidentally brick your Switch 2, or make more Joy-Cons that are about as durable as Humpty Dumpty, well, you might not be able to sue them over it if a court sees that the end-user license agreement is 100% legally binding. Nintendo is going to continue to do stuff like this until they get enough pushback. The problem is that there are enough devout Nintendo fans out there, especially due to the success of the Switch, to guarantee that the Switch 2 will have a successful launch. Nintendo fans are some of the most dedicated fans in all of gaming. Kinda like the gaming world equivalent of Disney fans. I used to be one of them for a long time. I grew up one, but I hit my breaking point with the original Wii and never felt the same about them again, and eventually veered off into PC gaming and retro gaming. And stuff like this just makes me even less likely to go back. When are a lot of other people going to hit their breaking point with this company? What is it going to take? I'm not sure, but I just hope Nintendo gets knocked down a peg or two sooner than later, right off their high horse. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments. Is there any chance of Nintendo changing their ways anytime soon? Or are they going to do some more terrible things in the name of control and protecting their intellectual properties? Let me know. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.